Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GBNews.
Good afternoon. It's time to debate the big issues of the day with me, Gloria DePiero, Liam Halligan, and a whole host of experts.
Today we're asking, is sleaze back in politics? That's ahead of an emergency Commons debate on parliamentary standards as the government continues to come under fire over allegations of political corruption.
But first, it's the news headlines with Rosie.
Good afternoon, it's 2 o'clock. Let's get you up to date. The Prime Minister says he takes accusations of government corruption seriously. Boris Johnson, who's visiting a hospital trust in Northumberland, was speaking ahead of an emergency debate this afternoon on parliamentary standards in the Commons. Last week, the government made a U-turn after a vote was passed to overhaul its misconduct system, blocking the suspension of Owen Paterson for breaching lobbying rules. There are now calls for a public inquiry.
What we're seeing now is I think that if I understand things correctly, the Speaker is saying he wants to have a cross-party approach to look at the issue of appeals in particularly difficult cases. And I totally support that.
To be clear, Prime Minister, you're not going to apologise for the one you acted.
Look, I think it's very important that we get this right, and we are going to make every effort to get it right, and we are going to hold MPs to account.
A rescue mission is underway to try to save a man who's been trapped inside a cave in South Wales for 2 days. He's been unable to move after reportedly injuring his back in a fall in the Brecon Beacons. At least 8 teams from across the UK have joined the effort to free him. Police in the French city of Cannes have shot a man who attacked a group of officers with a knife. One policeman was stabbed but escaped without injury, protected by his bulletproof vest. The suspect allegedly tried to attack a second officer when a third policeman opened fire. Sources say the attacker claimed to have been acting in the name of the Prophet. Former US President Barack Obama says island nations are the canaries in the coal mine of climate change. Speaking at the COP26 summit, he said wealthy countries have an added burden to help those less able and more vulnerable. He's expected to make a speech this afternoon detailing the progress that's been made since the Paris Agreement. UK travellers can now fly to the United States for the first time in nearly 2 years. The US has opened its borders to fully vaccinated visitors who must also take a COVID test within 3 days of arrival. Children need to be tested 3 to 5 days later. UK and US airlines synchronised a takeoff this morning to mark the occasion.
At home for so long, for somebody that travels quite a lot historically, a bit apprehensive, I guess, with all the hoops you have to jump through to travel, but otherwise, yeah, it's going to be a good change of scenery.
Just amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been a long time waiting to find out.
Exactly. We've just been waiting with bated breath, and then suddenly the announcement came, and yeah, so happy to be getting back to it. For me, it's my first time to the US, so really excited.
This is a massive moment for the aviation sector as we look to build back better from the terrible blow that the coronavirus pandemic has laid to us. So it's about people fundamentally. It's about getting families back together. It's about making sure that when you haven't seen friends for years that you're able to go out and do that. And that's particularly important with Thanksgiving and with Christmas coming up.
A British man killed in a shark attack off Western Australia has been described as a wonderful father. 57-year-old Paul Millichip was swimming at Port Beach near Perth when the alarm was raised. During a search for his body, police recovered a pair of goggles. His wife said he died doing what he loved.
Rest in peace, Paul. He died what he enjoyed doing the most, which was exercising. He was a wonderful man, wonderful father, and he loved his exercise.
Marks & Spencer has introduced pronoun-inclusive name badges for staff. The idea, which came from an employee, means that workers can now wear whichever combination of pronouns they choose. The supermarket chain says the initiative is a simple yet impactful way to make sure that LGBTQ+ identities are respected. A dress worn by Amy Winehouse has sold for more than £180,000 at auction. That's 16 times the original estimate. The halter neck was worn by the singer during her final stage performance, a month before her death at the age of 27. More than £3 million was raised from the sale of over 800 items, including clothing, handwritten notes and accessories. You are up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you the latest headlines in half an hour. Now back to Gloria and Liam.
Coming up today on DePiero and Halligan, as the government continues to come under fire over allegations of political corruption, we're asking, is sleaze back in British politics?
That's ahead of an emergency Commons debate on parliamentary standards being held at about 4:30 this afternoon.
But it's not just our guests we want to hear from. Join the debate with your view. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us @GBNews. Stay with us.
It's a political scandal which shows no sign of going away anytime soon. That's the allegations of sleaze being aimed at Boris Johnson's government.
This follows last week's row over Tory MP, as was Owen Paterson. He was found guilty of lobbying for businesses that had him on the payroll.
The Prime Minister had attempted to stop him from being suspended by changing the standards system, which found him guilty of breaching parliamentary rules.
But that was later reversed after an outcry from opposition parties. The controversy will now be discussed in the Commons in an emergency debate on parliamentary standards.
Well, the Prime Minister is visiting Hexham General Hospital in Northumberland, so we'll miss that debate. But he has been speaking about the allegations aimed at the government. This is what he had to say on the matter.
There's a debate today. Unfortunately, I can't be there because I have a long-standing engagement up here. But Labour want to focus, the opposition obviously want to focus on a particular case, a particular MP who suffered a serious personal tragedy and who's now resigned. Can I just finish off? And what we want to do, and I frankly, I don't think there's much more to be said about that particular case. I really don't. But what we do need to do is look also at the process. And that is what we were trying to do last week. And what I hope is that there will be, through the good offices of the Speaker, and what I read and I hear, that hope may be well-founded, there will be cross-party agreement on a way forward, including an appeals process for very difficult and very sad cases such as the one we've seen. There's been long-standing concerns amongst MPs across the House of Commons about the process. What we're seeing now is I think that if I understand things correctly, the Speaker is saying he wants to have a cross-party approach to look at the issue of appeals in particularly difficult cases. And I totally support that.
To be clear, Prime Minister, you're not going to apologise for the way you acted.
Look, I think it's very important that we get this right, and we are going to make every effort to get it right, and we are going to hold MPs to account. What I think is also, and MPs, as I said last week, should not break the rules.
Well, joining us in the studio now to reflect on that statement by the Prime Minister is our GB News political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, I'm a bit longer in the tooth than you, but this is reminding me of the major years, the sleaze of the 1990s that ultimately saw the Tories beaten by Tony Blair.
Well, interestingly, didn't we heard from John Major at the weekend saying that this was shameful, it was unconservative. Now, he's clearly not a fan of the government and particularly of Boris Johnson, it must be said. But, you know, it still hurts when you've got a former Prime Minister, a former Conservative Prime Minister saying that. And interestingly, of course, some of the rules that they want to change were set up actually under the Nolan Commission back in the mid-90s to deal with Conservative sleaze. Interesting, we're not going to hear from the Prime Minister today in this debate. Clearly an attempt by Number 10 to try and kill the story as much as they can. We're not even going to hear from Jacob Rees-Mogg, who of course is leader of the Commons. He's not going to take part in this emergency debate. Stephen Barclay instead is going to do that. But in the end, I don't think this story is necessarily going to go away terribly quickly because, first of all, the government do recognise that the rules need to be changed, as does the opposition. Clearly, in the Owen Paterson case, it was going to be retrospectively, which is why there was this whole furore around trying to help out an old pal, as it would seem, within the Conservative Party. So there will be this big discussion about what changes need to take place, particularly around MPs having second jobs, consultancy jobs, all from where they earn maybe double, 3 times their MP's salary. And Owen Paterson is not alone in that. And so I think that will be an ongoing debate. It'll be interesting also to see what the role of Lindsay Hoyle is, who's the Commons Speaker. Again, he's determined to bring forward some of these reforms. He's quite angry about the damage this is doing to MPs as a whole and to Parliament as an institution. How angry are Tory MPs? I think had to vote. Yeah, I think they're pretty angry. I mean, you know, Gloria, I'm sure there's stuff that potentially on 3-line whips that you had to vote for that you weren't terribly happy with. And on this, I think the anger is not because this was a kind of big flank of Conservative policy or something that was kind of transformed the country, but rather that many MPs felt deeply uncomfortable about having to do this. The suggestion some were threatened with money being withheld from their constituencies if they didn't vote. And yet, here we are yet again with this Conservative government, with this kind of Boris Johnson government, where, within the space of a day, the massive U-turn. And we've had dozens of U-turns by this government. At some point, those Conservative MPs are going to say, well, what is the point of doing this if potentially the government's going to change their mind? We know MPs got an awful lot of flack on this, getting emails from constituents and others. I should just add, also the reason I think this story's not going to go away, because it's now got tentacles that are going in lots of different questions, different directions. First of all, there's the role of Randox, which is one of the consulting firms that Owen Paterson was working for. And they receive millions, hundreds of millions of pounds of government contracts.
Heavily involved in the vaccine rollout and testing.
In testing, and they were not put out to tender. And so there'll be questions about the meetings that may well have taken place between Owen Paterson and health ministers around that. Second of all, there's still this investigation into Wallpapergate. Remember, the Prime Minister's very expensive wallpaper. Who funded it? Where did it go? Did it follow the rules?
In the Downing Street flat.
In the Downing Street flat. That's still to come. And then yesterday, we saw this kind of cash for honours story in the Sunday Times, where suggestions were kind of former Conservative donors were on a fast track just become members of the House of Lords. And so those stories aren't connected with the Owen Paterson one, but they are connected in some ways because they all feed in this perception, as Labour would like to portray it, of sleaze and corruption. But even for the government, in the kindest possible terms, it raises lots of questions about how our democracy functions, where money goes to, and what jobs people have. And that's why I think this story, even though the Conservative Party would love to shut it down today, is not going to go away anytime soon.
GBNews political editor Darren McCaffrey, as ever. Thank you.
Joining us now on the show is former Minister of State for Transport and former Lib Dem MP for Lewis, Norman Baker. Nice to see you, Norman Baker. Let's cut straight to the point. In this country, can companies or rich individuals buy political influence, in your view?
Sadly, yes. There's nothing wrong with lobbying per se. People are entitled to put forward their views as a business, to say what they think should happen in terms of public policy. But the issue is not really with business. The issue is with the system which allows that to be used by MPs who are there to represent their constituents, as you all know, Gloria, very well, and who are not there to be paid by a particular company to advance a particular policy. But you listen to the Prime Minister just now. He seemed very keen to make this an issue about whether there should be some sort of different appeals procedure within that narrow issue that affected Owen Paterson last week. It's not about that. It's about a much wider issue as to whether the government, and the Prime Minister in particular, respect the norms of a proper democratic society without corruption. And as John Major made very, very clear at the weekend, this goes way beyond the issue of whether there's an appeals procedure. This goes to whether the government can be trusted on this word. It goes to the contracts let for COVID engagement without proper process. It goes to the issue whether or not people can buy a seat in the House of Lords. It goes to the issue whether Priti Patel's judgment against her could just be ignored by the Prime Minister, despite an independent finding against her. The Prime Minister is very cavalier with proper procedures and with the norms we expect in a democracy. And that's the issue, really, way beyond whether the appeals process is correct in the Patterson case or not.
Norman Baker, you're no longer an MP, but in my experience, if I may say so, you're a very astute observer of Westminster. To what extent do you think Owen Paterson has any kind of defence? Obviously, his wife tragically committed suicide during this investigation, but just put that to one side, if you can put such a human tragedy to one side. He claims, and many people around him claim, that his witnesses weren't given a chance to put their side of events over to the Standards Authority. Is there any sense in which this investigative process was at least slightly unfair towards him, putting party politics aside?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's been investigations of many MPs over many years, and the first time the issue has been raised, in my experience, in terms of whether it's fair or not, was last week. Nobody seems to have complained about previous investigations. I don't know. I mean, I was not party to the full details. What I do know is that I respect the independent commissioner who looked into this matter, and I think we had a cross-party committee with Chris Bryant as chair and 7 lay members who looked at this matter over a period of 2 years. By the way, it was partly delayed at the request of Mr. Patterson, who wanted to have more time to look into matters. For 7 lay members and a cross-party committee reached a quite extraordinary conclusion in many ways, extraordinary in the sense it's unusual, of recommending a 30-day suspension. That's unheard of, really. And they regarded it as, I think, egregious was the word he used to determine his behaviour. But, Owen Paterson was one member of Parliament, and it's a tragedy for him that he behaved in this way, and obviously a tragedy as to what's happened in his personal life. I think much more concerning to me, rather than Owen Paterson, is what happened with the government, who sought to try to override an independent committee in the way they responded to this. I mean, that's far more serious matter to my mind.
Well, that's a good point, isn't it? Because that point suggests that actually, even though everyone's discussing new rules, including the Prime Minister, that the current system, which recommended suspending Owen Paterson, that actually the rules, if followed, work fine. Maybe we don't need any.
Well, I'm not sure we do need many changes, but if we do, let's discuss that separately. Again, it's a new thing that's been raised. But, the Prime Minister's got form. He wants to ignore this particular recommendation, which is inconvenient to him. He ignored the issue with Priti Patel, which was also criticising her for bullying staff. He regarded that as something that could be tossed aside. He was quite happy to prorogue Parliament against the laws, it turned out. This Prime Minister is cavalier with the way we behave in our democracy, and that's what's at fault here. And as John Major said on Saturday, this will end badly unless he changes his behaviour on these matters.
Norman Baker, we'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid, former Lib Dem MP, because we're crossing over live to the COP26 summit in Glasgow, where the former President of the United States, Barack Obama, has just stood up to give a speech.
Die hard. And when the issue at hand is the health of our planet and the world our children and our grandchildren will inherit, then you will have a hard time keeping me away. And that's why I'm here today, to talk about what's happened in the 6 years since I spoke to the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris, and to talk about the steps we need to take if we want to keep doing big things. Because when it comes to climate, time really is running out. You heard the same message from world leaders last week. And now that they've left, here's what we can report. Meaningful progress has been made since Paris. And the agreements made here in Glasgow thanks to so many of you, including my friend John Kerry here, who is tireless, and his team. Thanks to your efforts here in Glasgow, we see the promise of further progress. What is also true is that collectively and individually, we are still falling short. We have not done nearly enough to address this crisis. We are going to have to do more. And whether that happens or not, to a large degree, is going to depend on you. Not just those of you in this room, but anybody who's watching or reading a transcript of what I say here today. That was true 6 years ago as well. And in Paris, our goal was to turn progress into an enduring framework that would give the world confidence in a low-carbon future. An agreement where countries would update their emissions targets on a regular basis. An agreement that would help developing nations get the resources they need to skip the dirty phase of development and help those nations that are most vulnerable to climate change get the resources they need to adapt. An agreement that would give businesses and investors the certainty that the global economy is on a firm path towards a clean and sustainable future. In other words, our hope was to create an agreement that gave our planet a fighting chance. That was our ambition. And by some measures, the agreement has been a success. For the first time, leaders of nearly 200 nations, large and small, developed and developing, made a commitment to work together to confront a threat to the people of all nations. And that seemed proof that for all the divisions in our world, when a crisis threatens all of us, we can come together to address it. At the time, we also believed that if enough national governments showed they were serious about climate, then other institutions, particularly in the private sector, would start raising their sights as well. And over the last 6 years, that is what's happened. Today, more than 1/5 of the world's largest companies have set net zero emissions targets. Not just because it's the right thing to do for the environment, but in many cases because it makes sense for their bottom line. More than 700 cities in more than 50 countries have pledged to cut their emissions in half by the end of the decade and reach net zero by 2050. About 1/3 of the global banking sector has agreed to align their work with the Paris Agreement. So that's meaningful. Now, back in the United States, of course, some of our progress stalled when my successor decided to unilaterally pull out of the Paris Agreement in his first year in office. I wasn't real happy about that. And yet, the determination of our state and local governments, along with the regulations and investment that my administration had already put in place, allowed our country to keep moving forward, despite hostility from the White House. The $90 billion investment that we made in 2009 helped to jumpstart the clean energy industry in the United States, and markets adapted, and so did consumers. And even when the Trump administration rolled back emissions requirements for automakers, along with regulatory changes and efficiency standards, many businesses chose to stay the course. They kept reducing emissions. They continued the transition to electric vehicles and energy-saving appliances. The ball had been rolling, and it didn't stop. And meanwhile, science and technology continued to advance. So today, the price of solar and wind energy has dropped to the point where, in some places, clean energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. Around the world, scientists, and entrepreneurs are integrating abundant renewable energy, more powerful batteries, breakthroughs in fields like synthetic biology to invent a better future that is healthier and more affordable. That's all good news for the planet. And it is also good news for people looking for a job. In the U.S. alone, more than 3 million people now work in clean energy-related jobs. That is more than the number of people currently employed by the entire fossil fuel industry. So despite 4 years of active hostility toward climate science coming from the very top of our federal government, the American people managed to still meet our original commitment under the Paris Agreement. And not only that, but the rest of the world stayed in the deal. And now, with President Biden and his administration rejoining the agreement, the U.S. government is once again engaged and prepared to take a leadership role. And everybody who's been watching John Kerry run around here knows that we take that role seriously. As the world's second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, the U.S. has to lead. We have enormous responsibilities. And obviously, we still have a lot of work to do. But last week, Congress passed President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure bill that will, among other things, create jobs manufacturing solar panels and wind turbines and batteries and electric vehicles, and build out the first ever national network of charging stations so families can travel across the U.S. in electric vehicles. And I'm confident that a version of President Biden's Build Back Better bill will pass through Congress in the coming next few weeks. And here's what it will mean when that bill does pass. That legislation will devote over $500 billion to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by over 1 billion metric tons by the end of the decade, at least 10 times more than any legislation previously passed by Congress. Along the way, it will reduce consumer energy costs, it will invest in a clean energy economy, it will create hundreds of thousands of jobs, and it will set the United States on course to meet its new climate targets, achieving a 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by 2030. So the U.S. is back. And in moving more boldly, the U.S. is not alone. Earlier this year, the UK government, our hosts, announced a plan to cut emissions by almost 80% by 2035. This summer, the European Union put themselves on a path to carbon neutrality by 2050. Korea passed a Carbon Neutrality Act in September that requires the government to cut greenhouse gas emissions 35% or more by 2030. The Canadian government has laid out a path to carbon neutrality by 2050 with milestones to hit along the way. So, Paris showed the world that progress is possible, created a framework. Important work was done there, and important work has been done here. That is the good news. Now for the bad news. We are nowhere near where we need to be yet. For starters, despite the progress that Paris represented, most countries have failed to meet the action plans that they set 6 years ago. And the consequences of not moving fast enough are becoming more apparent all the time. Last month, a study found that 85% of the global population has experienced weather events that were more severe because of climate change. Stronger storms, longer heat waves, more intense flooding, crippling droughts. Parts of the world are becoming more dangerous to live in, triggering new migration patterns and worsening conflict around the globe. It's one of the reasons why The U.S. Pentagon and other U.S. agencies have said that climate change poses a national security threat for the U.S. and for everyone else. But not only did we not hit all of the targets that were pledged in Paris, but remember, Paris was always supposed to be a beginning, not an endpoint, of our joint effort to control climate change. Back in 2015, we knew that even if the commitments made as a part of the Paris Agreement were fully met, we would still fall short of our goal of keeping global temperature increases below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's why Paris was designed to be a framework for countries to constantly ratchet up their ambitions as they got more resources and as technology reduced the cost of transitioning to a clean energy economy. So we come now here to Glasgow, and just as true with the Paris Agreement, there is good news and bad news about what has happened here this past week. The good news, in large part because of the efforts of the people in this room, the hours of work that you spent with, weak coffee and bad food and feeling sleepy. Because of you, countries around the world are recognizing this is a decisive decade to avoid a climate disaster and are setting some really important goals for 2030. More than 100 countries this past week have committed to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. As all of you know, curbing methane emissions is currently the single fastest and most effective way to limit warming. More than 100 countries have also promised to stop and reverse deforestation by the end of 2030. Businesses from around the world, name brands, some of the biggest businesses on this planet, have agreed to help create a market for the technologies we need to transition to clean energy. Here in Glasgow, nations have also committed to help poorer countries move away from fossil fuels and deal with the effects of climate change. President Biden announced that the U.S. will be quadrupling its annual climate finance pledge over the next few years to $11 billion, including $3 billion dedicated to helping vulnerable countries adapt to the impacts of climate change. And the U.S., along with 20 other countries, agreed to stop publicly financing international fossil fuel development with limited exceptions. So these are significant accomplishments. They are hard-won commitments. You should be proud of yourselves, and we need to celebrate those commitments, even as we demand that the signatories to these commitments actually follow through. We have to track it. They're not self-executing. They're going to require effort. But let's assume that we actually delivered. That's significant. But once again, we also have to acknowledge that this progress is partial. Most nations have failed to be as ambitious as they need to be. The escalation, the ratcheting up of ambition that we anticipated in Paris 6 years ago has not been uniformly realized. I have to confess, it was particularly discouraging to see the leaders of two of the world's largest emitters, China and Russia, decline to even attend the proceedings. And their national plans so far reflect what appears to be a dangerous lack of urgency, a willingness to maintain the status quo on the part of those governments. And that's a shame. We need advanced economies like the US and Europe leading on this issue. But you know the facts. We also need China and India leading on this issue. We need Russia leading on this issue, just as we need Indonesia and South Africa and Brazil leading on this issue. We can't afford anybody on the sidelines. I recognize we're living in a moment when international cooperation has waned. A moment of greater geopolitical tension and stress, in part because of the pandemic, in part because of the rise of nationalism and tribal impulses around the world. And yes, in part because of a lack of leadership on America's part for 4 years on a host of multilateral issues. I understand that it's harder to get international cooperation. There are more global tensions. But there is one thing that should transcend our day-to-day politics and normal geopolitics, and that is climate change. It's not just that we can't afford to go backward, we can't afford to stay where we are. The world has to step up, and it has to step up now. So how is that going to happen? How do we close the gap between what's necessary for our survival and what seems politically possible right now? I confess, I don't have all the answers. As I'm sure is true for all of you out there, those of you who are steeped in this work, who are far more expert than me, there are times where I feel discouraged. There are times where the future seems somewhat bleak. There are times where I am doubtful that humanity can get its act together before it's too late. And images of dystopia start creeping into my dreams. And yet, whenever I feel such despondency, I remind myself that cynicism is the recourse of cowards. We can't afford hopelessness. Instead, we are going to have to muster the will and the passion and the activism of citizens pushing governments, companies, and everyone else to meet this challenge. That's what allowed the U.S. to do its part over the last few years to meet our climate goals, even when we didn't have much leadership on it. It wasn't just elected officials or CEOs doing the right thing. It was ordinary Americans making their voices heard, making it clear we need to solve this problem regardless of the obstacles. People who organized and educated others in their communities, people who put pressure on businesses and governments to do better, people who turn their passion into votes. That's the kind of commitment we're going to need going forward. Because let's face it, this is not just about raw numbers. This is not just about science. This is about politics. It's about culture. It's about morality. It's about the human dynamic. How do we work together to get a big thing done? And it's about participation and power. Thinking back on my own experience as president, I would have had the power to do even more to fight climate change during my time in office if I'd had a stable congressional majority that was willing and eager to take action. And for the bulk of my presidency, I didn't have that majority. Gaining such majorities require an engaged citizenry willing to do what it takes to reward politicians who take this problem seriously and send out of office those who don't. I am convinced that President Biden's Build Back Better bill will be historic and a huge plus for U.S. action on climate change. But keep in mind, Joe Biden wanted to do even more.
Now we are going back to our main talking point, the allegations of political corruption aimed at the government. Remember, there's still time to send your opinion on our debate. Is sleaze back in politics?
Get in touch with your views. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us @gbnews.
Joining us in the studio now is the former Conservative MP for Edmonton, Ian Twin. I'm sorry, I nearly put you back in the House of Commons then.
Well, that was quite a shock.
Ian, you were an MP until 1997.
Yes, prehistory for some people watching.
Indeed. Don't remind us how old we are. So you were serving when political sleaze was right at the top of the political agenda. How much was that a contributing factor to the demise of the Conservative Party?
Well, it certainly had an impact. I mean, actually, ERM and being thrown out had a much bigger impact. Black Wednesday, when we left, I could feel the mood change in my constituency, because the result of that was real hard economic hardship for people losing their homes, their small businesses. Sleaze, yeah, I mean, people got quite cross about it, but it's not quite the same thing.
Where do you stand, Ian, on MPs having second jobs? I mean, lots of MPs are lawyers. Some MPs are still practising doctors. Isn't it a good thing that if we have somebody who's on the front line of A&E one day and then the next day they're in the House of Commons informing our debate?
I think that, yes, it is very good, and second jobs are not a bad thing. They're quite difficult to manage, and there have to be clear demarcations. You can't have a surgeon cutting people up one day and then talking about wanting more resources for his own unit within the NHS. That would be lobbying, so that's wrong. So there has to be discretion. The House has to have good rules. Not sure it does at the moment. I think they're a bit complex and difficult to divine.
But surely anybody would know that being paid by a consultancy to lobby on behalf of a private company would be against the rules. And indeed, the Standards Committee found that in the case of Owen Paterson. It's not that complicated, is it? You can't get paid by a company to influence the laws.
No, I haven't read the 150-page report, to be honest, so I don't know all the ins and outs of it. I think that the pandemic has given a legitimate excuse, both to government and to MPs, to bring forward possibilities of new equipment, vaccines, testing equipment, because we were in a panic. We needed it quick, and the government were willing to spend more of our money buying all these things, much more than we wanted. And I think that was necessary. So let's forget Owen Paterson and the COVID time. But is there more sleaze in the House? There certainly must be some, and we do need clear rules. So I think the Speaker has said today he wants a cross-party approach to it, and that's absolutely right. You can't do things as single parties on this. Because any opposition worth its salt is going to say, I'm not going to take part in this. So we're going to have to talk quietly and thoughtfully to get the results right. And if that means we need an appeal system so that people are heard properly, I can see the point of that. Just having one commissioner writing a report, not hearing all the witnesses, and that's only one person, and then a committee, however balanced that is, just saying, OK, that's the Commissioner's report. We trust the Commissioner, therefore we'll just endorse it. I don't think that's good enough.
In the case of Owen Paterson, he has said, not least in his resignation letter, and lots of his friends have said, that appeals process wasn't fair. His witnesses weren't allowed to give evidence. The Standards Commissioner seemed less than willing to hear his side of the story, according to him. Do you think there's something in that?
There may be. I don't know. Obviously, I don't know. There may be, and I think the Speaker is right to say that we need to just calm down, cool down, and look at this with a cool process, because the damage done to all MPs and anyone who wants to be an MP and anyone who likes the political process is very hard to cope with. I mean, we just don't need this. We've got lots of things which, climate change, for instance, we've been hearing about just now. We really do need to spend our time on the serious issues, and MPs and members of the House of Lords need to follow the rules.
The House of Lords, you mentioned, interesting. Do you think there's anything honourable about appointments to the House of Lords, or is there sometimes dishonour in those appointments to the House of Lords?
Unless you're an elected hereditary peer or an archbishop, the only way is by appointment to get there. personally, a political scientist, I would have gone for an elected regional chamber years ago. Post Tony Blair, I think there's nothing wrong with it, actually, up until Tony Blair's reforms, because everyone knew exactly what it was. It was a thoughtful check on the House of Commons and no more. Now, it has more powers, more pretensions to powers, and I'm not sure it's working very well. Too many people in it to start with.
You said everybody knows it is about transparency. What would you say to a lot of Conservatives who criticise the fact that Labour MPs are often helped in their campaigns by trade unions? It's completely transparent. Everyone knows that happens. Does that make a difference?
Well, I was one of those. I'm rare, but I was a Conservative-sponsored trade union MP with my Polytechnic union, because I was a teacher at Southampton Poly. Yeah, and everybody does know these things are clearly set out in the members' interests. But if we were to stop all second incomes, I think that would have to be stopped. And doctors working weekends would have to be stopped. Dentists keeping up their skills so they could still be a practicing dentist would have to stop. Lawyers, that would have to stop. Lawyers are lobbyists most of the time. People don't realise. People think these lawyers are these trendy things with gowns on and wigs, but they're not. They're actually working out good ways to lobby.
But then
that has to stop.
Then we end up with a house that's just full of political robots and automatons. People know nothing about the real world.
Exactly. And I think that I learned quite a lot from taking on a directorship with Thorn Lighting when I was on that in the House. I was a Polytechnic lecturer. I got elected for a safe Labour seat. It was something of a surprise. And I learned a lot more about business by having the monthly bundles of paper and having to understand them and see colleagues on the board.
Ian Twin, former MP, Conservative MP for Edmonton, thank you. This debate will go on.
Right, after the break, it's all about your opinion, and we've got more great guests who join the debate next on DePiero and Halligan.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. Joining us now on the show is Labour MP for Blackley and Broughton, Graham Stringer. Graham Stringer, sleaze, it happens under the governments of every colour. How do you plead to that suggestion?
Well, that's obviously true.
Wow, I wasn't expecting such a succinct answer. Liam, over to you.
Are we going... Is this... You've been in the House a long time. Gloria and I even remember the 90s in the House of Commons. Are the Tories in a situation where they were under John Major, with sleaze really contributing to a landslide victory for Labour?
I think it's worse than that, actually, for the Conservatives, because what happened under John Major is, after he announced he wanted to go to a back to basics policy and family values, there are a whole series of sexual scandals involving Conservative MPs and some financial scandals about cash for questions, and he couldn't get a grip on it, really. He set up the Nolan Committee about standards in public life, but it was what individual MPs did at that time was very difficult for him to control. What we've got now, really, with Owen Paterson, is the system working relatively well. It's exposed what I think was Owen's bad judgment, and he was in breach of the rules. So that's working. I agree with your previous speaker that there probably should be an appeals process in the system. But apart from that, I think it was pretty fair. But on the other side of the equation, it's ministers and ex-ministers who are, it's easier to call out for being corrupt, A, in the way that contracts were handed out during the COVID crisis. And one of the things that isn't talked about enough is that 2/3 of ministers go on to get jobs in the area that they were responsible for as a minister. And one can't help but think that their judgment as a minister might be affected by the possibility of getting employment in the area they were dealing with. 6 ex-energy ministers have gone on to work in the energy industry.
You were so succinct in my first question. I'm going to have another go. Do you think that companies or rich individuals can buy political influence in this country?
I think they try. I think the rules, and they've been like that since the end of the 17th century, are against, they're very clearly and strictly against you advocating on behalf of a financial, an interest of which you're gaining financial reward for. But I think businesses are always legitimately trying to influence Parliament, because if we get the regulations wrong for industry, then we can damage jobs and employment. But they sometimes try to go beyond that area. That certainly happened at the start of the Labour government in '97. It happened during the mid-90s under Major. I think it's much more difficult now. But of course, business and Parliament are full of human beings, and some of them take a chance. But I think the rules within Parliament are pretty good. Transparency works, and the fact that we're all talking about Owen Paterson means that those rules have been working. Where I think they will work less well is in government, when the Prime Minister is in charge of the ministerial code. And I think his own behaviour is occasionally falling below what one would expect both of an MP and a minister.
Graham Stringer, we'll have to leave it there. Labour MP for Blackley and Broughton, thanks a lot for joining us. As ever, we're joined now at the end of the show by the Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, opinion pollster extraordinaire, Sir John Curtis. John, great to have you, as ever, on GB News. Are there signs that the sleaze headlines are damaging the Tories in the polls yet?
Yes, there are. We've had 2 opinion polls, one from YouGov and one from Opinion, conducted after the story broke. And in both cases, the same company had polled just a week earlier. So we've got as pretty close as we could expect to get of, as it were, a pre and post measure. In both cases, the Conservative vote was down by 3 points as compared with the previous week, and Labour is up a point or 2. So certainly the Conservatives, on those 2 polls at least, do seem to have taken a hit. What's also true, and I think perhaps is equally important, is to look at some of the numbers, and when people are being asked about whether or not they thought it was right that Owen Paterson was going to be suspended, whether or not they thought the Prime Minister was right or wrong in trying to stop that suspension from being implemented. And what you get consistently from both those two polls and also another poll from JR Partners, who didn't ask voting intention but asked a lot about the allegations, what you find is typically around 60, 70% of people saying Prime Minister is wrong, it was Owen Paterson should have been suspended. And crucially, what you discover is that the proportion saying that is almost as high amongst those who voted Conservative in 2019 as it is amongst those who voted for the opposition party. So this isn't just simply a case of opposition voters going, yeah, sucks, I don't like Boris Johnson, so therefore I don't like anything that Boris Johnson does. It's pretty clear that there is a degree of disquiet and concern amongst Conservative voters. Indeed, I think perhaps in particular of some traditional Conservative voters, the kind of people who have never necessarily been particularly enamored of Boris Johnson, may well have voted Remain back in 2016, but have stuck with the Conservatives because they are true blue Tories. But amongst that group, there are signs that perhaps this event has indeed begun to make some of them question their loyalty.
The government made a mistake. They realised that they'd made a mistake and have attempted to put that mistake right. Surely that counts for something in the gallery of public opinion.
It might do, Gloria. And I think, one possible response to what I've said is, well, it's a short-term hit for the government from which we'll be able to recover. And the fact that in the end, as it were, it changed its mind, the government's been helping to do that. That said, one point to bear in mind, remember Alistair Campbell's rule that, if a story only is in the headlines for 2 or 3 days, well, that's fine, you can expect to work it out. If it's still in the news nearly a week later, you've got a problem. But this story is now, 5 days old, and it's still tending to dominate the headlines. So it's not something necessarily going to go away. And the second thing, which we don't...
John Curtis has frozen. We were hanging on his every word, as we always do. But it is the end of... We have come to the end of the show.
Thanks a lot for being with us. You've been watching DePiero and Halligan here on GB News. We're back tomorrow as a pair, as ever, at 2 p.m.
I'm back at midday. You're back at 1.
With On the Money, you lucky people. And in just a moment, Darren McCaffrey, for it is he, our political editor, will be with you for your daily dose of political news.
I wonder what he'll be talking about. Because actually, no, the Commons debate is at 4:30 now. Right. That debate that lasts for 3 hours. We'll be bringing you that live when that happens too.
Thanks a lot for being with us today, and we'll see you tomorrow. This is Liam and Gloria here on GB News.
Hi there. A lot of cloud for many of us through the rest of today, with outbreaks of rain into the north and the west. Drier elsewhere, with still some sunshine ahead of the main weather front, which is moving into northwestern areas. This low pressure pushing towards Iceland, so far enough away from the UK, but its trailing weather fronts are bringing some outbreaks of rain to mainly northwestern, but some western parts of the UK as well. So that's where we've got the thickening cloud, turning damp across parts of Wales into the southwest as well. The more persistent rain therefore, northwest England, western Scotland, clearing up for Northern Ireland. Ahead of the rain, actually some sunshine there for the East Midlands into East Anglia and the southeast. A little bit milder in many places compared to Sunday, 12 to 13 or 14 Celsius. Into the evening, and strengthening winds push further outbreaks of rain into the western Scotland as well as Northern Ireland. Trailing cloud and some small outbreaks of rain elsewhere, but generally a cloudy picture overnight, and with that breeze, it's going to be a milder night with temperatures holding up well above zero. We're looking at 8 to 12 Celsius by and large as we start off Tuesday. But a damp start there.